Ava smirked, confidence radiating from her as she reached for the in-flight phone. "Security, I need officers at Gate 14 immediately. 2 passengers in first class are refusing to comply." Her voice was calm, authoritative, like she had won. But before she could even set the phone back down, a voice cut through the cabin. "That won't be necessary." Passengers turned. A woman in a tailored black dress stood near the front of the plane, her presence commanding. She held up her phone, the airline's corporate logo visible on the screen. "Elaine Chambers, Senior VP of Customer Experience. I was just informed that there's an issue on this flight." Her eyes locked onto Ava, sharp as steel. "And from what I've seen, the only issue here is you." Ava's face drained of color. 7 minutes. That's how long it had taken for Marcus and Naya's message to reach the highest levels of the airline. The intercom crackled. "Ava Richardson, report to the cockpit immediately." Passengers exchanged looks, whispers whippling through the cabin. Ava hesitated, then stiffly walked toward the front. Minutes later, she returned, face pale, shoulders stiff. The captain's voice followed. "Miss Richardson has been relieved of duty. Flight attendants, please continue service." Ava stood frozen, but the security officers at the gate had arrived. "Ma'am, you need to step off the plane." The once powerful flight attendant had no choice but to gather her things and walk the aisle of shame. As she passed, Nia met her eyes, not with smugness, not with anger, just quiet, undeniable power. Ava looked away, and just like that, the balance shifted. But before we go deeper into the full story, tell me where you're watching from in the comments below, and if you love these stories of justice, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss one. A warm Miami afternoon bathed the airport in golden sunlight, the glass windows of the terminal reflecting the steady stream of travelers moving with purpose. Inside, the boarding gate for Flight 227 to Los Angeles buzzed with the usual energy of a packed flight. Families juggling carry-ons, business executives checking emails, vacationers snapping last-minute selfies before departure. The boarding process had been smooth so far, a well-rehearsed dance of scanning tickets and directing passengers down the jet bridge. In first class, the air was cooler, quieter, a stark contrast to the chaos beyond the curtain that separated it from the main cabin. Plush leather seats gleamed under the soft glow of the overhead lights, each space designed for comfort and exclusivity. Businessmen in tailored suits sat with an air of practiced ease, some already tapping away on their laptops, while others leaned back, savoring the extra legroom. A retired couple, dressed in casual elegance, clinked glasses of champagne, exchanging soft laughter as they prepared for their cross-country trip. A young influencer, her sleek designer bag tucked neatly under the seat, adjusted her phone on a stand, setting up for a mid-flight vlog. For most, this was just another flight, routine, predictable. But beneath the hum of quiet conversations and the clinking of glasses, something lingered, a subtle, unspoken tension, one that had not yet taken form but waited, like static before a storm. A woman in a crisp flight attendant uniform moved with precision through the cabin, her presence exuding the controlled authority of someone who considered this space her domain. Ava Richardson had worked first class for years, long enough to know its unspoken rules. This section wasn't just about luxury, it was about belonging, about who fit in and who didn't. And as her sharp eyes scanned the cabin, cataloging each passenger, they paused just for a moment when Marcus and Nia Bennett entered. Dressed with understated sophistication, the couple carried themselves with quiet confidence. Marcus, a tall man with an air of refined composure, wore a charcoal gray blazer over a deep blue button-down, his polished watch catching the light as he adjusted the strap of his carry-on. Nia, poised yet commanding, was effortlessly elegant in a fitted black dress, her natural curls framing a face that held both intelligence and quiet power. They moved with the certainty of people who belonged exactly where they were, and yet, as they settled into their seats, Ava's gaze lingered just a second too long. She didn't say anything, not yet, but in that glance, assessing, calculating, doubting, there was a question, unspoken but clear: "Are you sure you belong here?" Marcus Bennett adjusted his cufflinks with the quiet precision of a man who understood the power of appearances. His navy suit, tailored to perfection, spoke of someone who valued detail, who recognized the silent authority that came with polished shoes and a well-fitted blazer. Years in the financial world had taught him that perception often dictated reality, that a firm handshake and measured words could tilt a deal in his favor before numbers were ever discussed. But beyond the sharp attire and the quiet confidence, there was something else. An unshakable awareness, the kind developed over years of being in rooms where he was both respected and suddenly doubted, acknowledged yet scrutinized. He had learned to read people quickly, to sense the slight shifts in tone, the lingering glances that whispered the same silent question, "How did you get here?" Nia Bennett knew those looks too, but unlike her husband, she rarely ignored them. A civil rights attorney with a reputation for dismantling bias with precision, she had built a career out of knowing when to let her silence speak and when to let her voice cut through the noise. Where Marcus calculated, Nia confronted, not with aggression, but with the unwavering presence of someone who had spent years ensuring that doors didn't just open for her, but stayed open for those who followed. She moved with an ease that was both practiced and innate, her every step a reminder that she belonged in whatever space she occupied. Dressed in an effortlessly elegant black dress, her pearl earrings understated but deliberate, she was a woman who knew her worth and never asked for permission. As they settled into their first-class seats, the hum of the cabin a low murmur around them, Nia reached for Marcus's hand, her fingers resting lightly on his. He glanced at her, a silent exchange passing between them, a conversation without words, one built on years of understanding. They had both felt it the moment they boarded, the moment Ava Richardson's gaze had lingered just a second too long. Ava carried herself like someone who believed first class was an extension of her authority. Everything about her, the crisp uniform, the perfectly pinned blonde bun, the way she adjusted her posture when speaking to a certain type of passenger, suggested that she didn't just enforce the rules. She decided who the rules applied to. She had worked these aisles long enough to recognize the familiar rhythms of power, of privilege, of expectations, and when something disrupted those rhythms even slightly, she noticed. She wouldn't say anything outright, that wasn't her style. Discrimination was more palatable when wrapped in professionalism, more defensible when hidden beneath company policy. She prided herself on knowing how to maintain control without ever raising her voice, how to make someone uncomfortable without ever giving them something tangible to push back against. Rachel, Wynne, standing just a few feet away, had noticed it too. She always noticed the unspoken moments, the shifts in energy, the way Ava's body language changed depending on who she was addressing. Rachel had been working under Ava long enough to understand that while Ava never broke the rules, she bent them to fit her preferences. Unlike Ava, Rachel hadn't been in the industry for long. She was still learning the rhythms of first class, still figuring out when to speak and when to stay silent, and right now her silence felt heavy. She had seen Marcus and Nia hand over their tickets, had watched Ava check them a little too thoroughly, had felt the hesitation in Ava's movements. She had wanted to say something, to ease the tension she could feel settling over the cabin like an unseen weight, but she hadn't. Captain Thomas Blake sat in the cockpit, oblivious to the small storm brewing in first class. He had been flying for over 20 years, long enough to know that drama on a flight was never good for business. He ran his crew with a steady hand, a man who believed in order and efficiency. Fairness mattered to him, but so did keeping things moving. He didn't involve himself in cabin matters unless he had to. As long as the flight ran smoothly, he preferred to let his crew handle the details. But today, the details were about to become impossible to ignore. Marcus and Nia stepped onto the plane with the quiet assurance of people who had done this 100 times before. There was no hesitation in their steps, no need to double-check their seat assignments or fumble with their boarding passes. They knew exactly where they were going. Marcus led the way, his grip firm on the handle of his sleek leather carry-on, while Nia followed just behind, her posture straight, her heels clicking softly against the aisle floor. To anyone watching, they were the picture of effortless confidence, the kind of passengers who fit seamlessly into first class. And yet, the moment they entered the cabin, the air shifted. It was subtle, nothing overt, nothing that could be pointed to as concrete evidence of discomfort, but it was there. A brief pause in conversation, a momentary flicker of hesitation as eyes lifted from phones and magazines, a slight straightening of backs, an almost imperceptible readjustment of space, as if their mere presence had disrupted an unspoken equilibrium. Ava noticed them immediately. She had been arranging a set of freshly folded blankets when she caught sight of Marcus's broad frame and Naya's poised figure moving through the cabin. Her expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something, just for a second, not outright hostility, not even overt skepticism, just a pause, a hesitation, an unspoken question that hung in the space between them. Are you sure you're in the right place? Marcus saw it. He always saw it. The quick assessment, the calculation, the way some people instinctively glanced at him and then at his seat, as if the two didn't quite belong together. It wasn't new. He had felt it in boardrooms, in luxury hotels, in restaurants where the waiter asked if he was waiting for someone before seating him. It was a look that said, "You're successful, sure, but are you supposed to be here?" He didn't react. He never did. Instead, he continued forward, his movements smooth, controlled, unbothered. Nia saw it too, but unlike her husband, she never let it slide by unnoticed. She caught Ava's gaze and held it for a beat longer than necessary, just enough to acknowledge that she was aware, just enough to make Ava blink and turn back toward the blankets. That was enough for now. The businessman in 3A, an older man in a crisp gray suit, shifted slightly in his seat as Marcus passed. He didn't say anything, but the way his eyes followed them was telling. A woman 2 rows back, elegantly dressed in a navy pool blouse, gave a polite but tight-lipped smile as Nia slid into her seat. Others didn't look at all, making a deliberate effort to keep their focus on their devices, as if ignoring the shift in energy would make it disappear. Rachel, standing near the galley, caught the entire exchange. She wasn't surprised. She had seen it before. The difference in how some passengers were welcomed with warm smiles and effortless service, while others were met with cool professionalism and just enough politeness to avoid outright confrontation. Ava was good at that, keeping things just on the right side of acceptable. Rachel watched as Marcus and Nia settled in, noting the way Nia adjusted her dress with a slow, deliberate grace, as if reclaiming her space, as if daring anyone to question her presence. Ava exhaled softly and smoothed her uniform, turning back toward the cabin with a practiced smile. She wouldn't say anything, not yet, but she wasn't done assessing them. Ava moved with purpose, adjusting the tray of neatly arranged glasses if preparing for takeoff, but her eyes kept drifting back to Marcus and Nia. Something about them unsettled her. Not in an obvious way, but in the way that gnawed at the edges of her perception. She had seen passengers like them before. Well-dressed, well-spoken, perfectly put together. The type that carried themselves with confidence, almost as if they were trying to prove something. She had learned to trust her instincts, and right now, something felt off. She smoothed her uniform, straightened her posture, and walked toward them. Her expression was pleasant, almost too pleasant, her smile just a little too tight. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carefully modulated to sound polite, professional, but firm. "Would you mind letting me see your tickets again, just for verification?" Marcus didn't react right away. He glanced at her, his expression unreadable, before shifting his gaze to Nia. She had already expected this. It wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. Without a word, she reached into her handbag, pulled out the neatly folded boarding passes, and handed them over, her movements controlled and deliberate. "Of course," she said, her tone smooth, giving nothing away. Ava took the tickets, scanning them as if searching for something that wasn't there. She flipped them over once, twice, her fingers lingering just a little too long on the printed names. Her brows furrowed slightly, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her face, before she forced another smile. "Thank you," she said, handing them back, her voice betraying the faintest trace of hesitation. The interaction was brief, but the energy in the cabin shifted. A businessman seated across the aisle, pretending to read his newspaper, lowered it just slightly, eyes flickering toward the exchange. A woman 2 rows ahead glanced over her shoulder, then quickly looked away. Others who had been busy adjusting their seats or scrolling through their phones suddenly seemed more aware, their movements slowing, their attention caught on something they couldn't quite name. Marcus took the tickets from Nia and slid them into the side pocket of his blazer without a word. He didn't need to say anything. The weight of the moment, of what had just happened, was already settling between them like an unspoken truth. He could feel Nia's frustration, tightly contained beneath her calm exterior, the way she held herself still, controlled, as if refusing to give Ava the satisfaction of any visible reaction. Ava hesitated for a beat longer than necessary, as if debating whether to say more, but finally turned away. As she walked back toward the galley, Rachel caught her eye. "What was that about?" Rachel asked quietly, her voice careful. Ava shrugged, keeping her expression neutral. "Just making sure everything's in order," she said, but there was something too casual in the way she said it, something forced. Rachel didn't respond, but she didn't need to. She had seen this before, too many times to count. The way suspicion wrapped itself in procedure, the way professionalism was used as a shield for something uglier. Back in their seats, Nia exhaled softly, smoothing the fabric of her dress before turning her head slightly toward Marcus. "That was intentional," she murmured, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "I know," he said, his jaw tightening. "Let's see how far she takes it." Ava walked away, but the stiffness in her shoulders betrayed her thoughts. She gripped the edge of the service cart a little too tightly, her mind still processing what she had just seen, or rather, what she hadn't. The tickets were valid, no errors, no discrepancies, nothing to justify the gnawing feeling in her gut. And yet, something still felt off. She had worked first class long enough to recognize patterns, to know the type of passengers who belonged here, who fit seamlessly into the quiet exclusivity of this space. And for reasons she couldn't quite articulate, Marcus and Nia Bennett disrupted that pattern. She turned toward the galley, but instead of focusing on her pre-flight tasks, her gaze flickered back toward them. They weren't doing anything unusual. Marcus was scrolling through his phone with the casual focus of a man used to handling million-dollar deals between takeoff and landing. Nia adjusted the bracelet on her wrist before reaching for the in-flight menu, her movements slow, composed, utterly unbothered. And yet, Ava's instincts told her to keep watching. Across the aisle, a businessman in a crisp gray suit leaned toward his seatmate, his voice low but unmistakable. That was weird. She didn't do that with anyone else. His companion, a woman with perfectly styled blonde hair, glanced at him briefly before looking back at her tablet, her fingers hesitating over the screen. "I noticed that too," she murmured. "I thought maybe their tickets weren't scanning properly," but she trailed off, exchanging a look with the man, their unspoken thoughts settling between them. Further down the row, another passenger, a middle-aged woman sipping a pre-fleet mimosa, shifted in her seat. She had been flipping through a magazine when the interaction had unfolded, but now she found herself replaying it in her mind. She had flown first class dozens of times and had never once been asked to verify her ticket after boarding. Not once. Rachel, still near the galley, wiped a hand over her uniform, exhaling softly. She had noticed it too, the way Ava's fingers had lingered over those tickets just a little too long, the way she had flipped them over once, then again, as if willing a problem to appear where none existed, and the way she had finally nodded, not with the crisp efficiency of a job well done, but with reluctance, like someone who had lost a battle they didn't even realize they had started. Marcus caught the brief flicker of movement in Ava's direction and smirked to himself. He knew that look. He had seen it in boardrooms, at exclusive events, in spaces where people like him weren't always expected, but where they damn sure belonged. The game had begun, and now it was only a matter of time before Ava made her next move. Ava took her time before returning. She moved through the first-class cabin with the air of someone who had important duties to attend to, adjusting headrests, responding to passenger requests with mechanical politeness, but every so often her gaze flickered toward Marcus and Nia. Something about them still didn't sit right with her. The confidence, the ease. It was too practiced. She had dealt with enough difficult passengers over the years to recognize when someone was going to be a problem, and in her mind they already were. She finally turned back toward them, smoothing the fabric of her uniform as if preparing for a more official confrontation. Her expression was carefully neutral, but the warmth from before had vanished, replaced with something colder, more calculated. "Mr. and Mrs. Bennett," she said, her voice just loud enough for surrounding passengers to hear. "I need to speak with you regarding your seats." Marcus looked up from his phone, arching an eyebrow but saying nothing. Nia, who had just reached for her glass of water, let her fingers rest on the stem of the glass as she turned her attention to Ava. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her tone polite but firm. "There seems to have been a mix-up with the seating assignments," Ava continued, folding her hands in front of her. "I need to ask you both to step to the galley so we can get this sorted out." A few passengers glanced up from their screens, the ones who had already noticed the first interaction now paying closer attention. The businessman across the aisle shifted slightly, watching with mild curiosity. Nia didn't move. "A mix-up?" she repeated. "Our tickets were scanned and confirmed at the gate." Ava offered a tight-lipped smile, the kind that barely reached her eyes. "I understand, but there's been an issue with the system. I just need to verify some information." Nia exhaled slowly through her nose, her patience thinning. She could feel the eyes on them, the quiet but growing tension in the air. She had seen this play out in different settings, clients turned away at high-end establishments, job candidates mysteriously misplaced in an interview lineup, the small, relentless ways certain people were made to prove they belonged. And now here they were, in first class, being asked to step away like schoolchildren called to the principal's office. She leaned back in her seat, crossing one leg over the other, and gave Ava a long, measured look. "If there's an issue," she said, voice smooth as glass, "we can discuss it right here." Ava's jaw tightened. She was expecting compliance, a quiet acceptance. She hadn't anticipated resistance, at least not this soon. "It's standard procedure," she said, her voice cooling another degree. "Is it?" Nia countered, tilting her head slightly. "Because I didn't see you pulling anyone else aside for a seating mix-up." A ripple of awareness moved through the cabin. A couple of passengers exchanged glances. Rachel, standing near the galley, sucked in a breath but said nothing. Ava's smile thinned. "I'd appreciate your cooperation." Nia held her gaze, unblinking. "And I'd appreciate not being singled out for no reason." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension sat between them, heavy and unyielding. Then Marcus shifted slightly, adjusting his watch, his voice quiet but deliberate. "Is there someone else we should be speaking to?" Ava hesitated just for a second, but it was enough. The businessman across the aisle let out a slow exhale, muttering under his breath, "This is getting ridiculous." Ava's composure cracked, but only slightly. "I'll be right back," she said stiffly, before turning on her heel and walking briskly toward the galley. As she disappeared, Nia exhaled, shaking her head slightly. "She's not done," she murmured to Marcus. Marcus smirked, glancing toward the front of the cabin where Ava had vanished. "No," he agreed, his voice low. "She's just getting started." Ava returned with a sharper stride, her movements more rigid, her grip tightening around the small notepad she carried as if it gave her authority. Her forced politeness had thinned, replaced by something steelier, something that made it clear she wasn't asking anymore, she was telling. Stopping just beside their seats, she squared her shoulders and inhaled deeply before speaking. "Mr. and Mrs. Bennett," she said, her voice lower this time, meant for them but loud enough to be overheard, "I need you both to come with me to the galley so we can resolve this matter privately." Marcus didn't react at first. He had been expecting this. He had seen it coming the moment Ava had taken their tickets the second time, the moment she lingered too long, the moment she had walked away without truly letting it go. He didn't look at her right away. Instead, he exhaled slowly, set his phone face down on the armrest, and met her gaze with a deliberate calm. "I don't think that's necessary," he said, his voice even. "We can discuss anything right here." Ava's expression didn't change, but the tension in her posture grew, the slight clench of her jaw betraying her frustration. She had expected them to comply. people usually did. The authority of a uniform, the weight of professionalism, it was usually enough, but not with them. "Sir, I'm asking you to come with me so we can avoid further disruption," she said, her voice clipped. "This is standard protocol." Marcus's jaw tightened slightly, a fleeting reaction, but one Nia caught immediately. She had seen that look before, the restrained patience, the way his fingers lightly tapped against the seat's armrest as if measuring the seconds before a decision had to be made. She knew what this was, a test, not just of their patience, but of their ability to remain composed while being made to prove yet again that they belonged where they were. She moved first. With slow, deliberate grace, Nia unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, the movement effortless but powerful. The energy around them shifted instantly. Conversations dimmed, a few passengers subtly turning their heads, eyes flickering toward the scene unfolding in the aisle. She didn't look at them, she didn't acknowledge the whispers or the tension creeping through the cabin. She only looked at Ava. Her voice was smooth, controlled, but there was a razor's edge to it. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," she said, adjusting the bracelet on her wrist as if she had all the time in the world. "You need us to step away from our seats that we paid for, so we can resolve an issue that doesn't actually exist?" Ava straightened, pressing the notepad against her chest. "Ma'am, I need to confirm your seating situation, and I'd rather not do that in the middle of the cabin." Nia's lips parted slightly in amusement, a humorless chuckle slipping through. "You'd rather not?" she repeated, tilting her head slightly. "Interesting, because I don't recall you having this conversation with anyone else, just us." Ava's jaw tensed. "I'm simply following procedure." Nia let the silence stretch between them, holding Ava's gaze for an excruciating beat. Then, slowly, she turned her head, looking toward the businessman across the aisle, the woman 3 rows ahead, the couple near the bulkhead, making a point of acknowledging every single person watching before turning back to Ava. "Is that true?" she asked, her voice quieter now, more dangerous. "Because I'd love to hear what part of the airline's policy states that passengers with confirmed first-class tickets need to be removed from their seats for verification." A ripple of unease moved through the cabin. Rachel, who had been standing near the galley, bit the inside of her cheek. She had seen Ava handle difficult passengers before, but this wasn't that. This wasn't some unruly guest refusing to comply with safety instructions. This was different, and the longer it went on, the worse it looked. Ava exhaled sharply, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "Mrs. Bennett, I'm trying to keep this professional." "Oh, I can see that," Nia said, her tone smooth. "Which is why I'll ask again, what exactly are we discussing in the galley that can't be said right here?" Marcus finally moved, sitting forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. He looked at Ava with the same unshakable calm that had won him more business negotiations than he could count. "If there's a seating issue, feel free to address it now," he said. "But we won't be moving." Ava's fingers curled tightly around the notepad. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty passed over her face. She had been in control of this moment when she had first approached, but now the power was slipping. She could feel it, the slow but undeniable shift of perception, the whispers growing, the passengers watching. Her voice dropped lower, laced with warning. "If you refuse to cooperate, I will have to escalate this matter." Marcus and Nia exchanged a glance. The moment had arrived, the one where they either played into the expectation or forced Ava to own the reality of what she was doing. Nia folded her arms and smiled, then escalated. Rachel stood frozen near the galley, gripping the handle of the drink cart just a little too tightly. She could feel it now, the shift in the air, the way the atmosphere in first class had turned thick, weighted, uncomfortably charged. Passengers were no longer just glancing up. They were watching, eyes flickering between Ava and the Bennetts with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. Some looked away quickly, pretending not to see, but others were fully engaged, quietly assessing the confrontation unfolding before them. Across the aisle, the businessman in 3A exhaled sharply, shaking his head as he crossed his arms. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath, but not low enough to go unheard. His seatmate, the woman with the sleek blonde bob, looked at him hesitantly, as if debating whether to agree out loud. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her fingers curling around the edges of her tablet before finally murmuring, "It does seem unnecessary." A few rows back, a woman in a navy blazer angled her phone slightly, her fingers moving discreetly as she tapped the record button. She wasn't sure if this would escalate, but something told her it might. These kinds of things had a way of spiraling, and if it did, she wanted proof of exactly how it had started. A man in the last row of first class leaned slightly forward, his elbow resting on the armrest as he watched with narrowed eyes. He had been half asleep before, but now he was paying attention. He had flown enough to know that people weren't usually asked to leave their first-class seats for a mix-up. If there had been a real issue, it would have been handled before takeoff, not mid-boarding, not like this. Rachel's pulse quickened as she caught Ava's expression, the barely contained frustration beneath her tight-lipped smile, the way her fingers curled ever so slightly at her sides, the way her posture had stiffened in response to the growing awareness of their audience. Ava had expected control, obedience. Instead, she had an entire cabin watching her, waiting to see what she would do next. Rachel swallowed hard. She wanted to say something. She wanted to step in, to diffuse the moment before it went too far, but her feet stayed rooted to the floor, her training warring with her conscience. This wasn't her battle to fight. At least, that's what she told herself. Ava seemed to sense the shift, the subtle but undeniable wave of scrutiny pressing against her. Her authority, once unquestioned, now felt exposed, fragile. For a brief moment, she hesitated, but then, jaw tightening, she reached for the in-flight phone near the galley. She was making the call. The moment those words left her mouth, everything would change. Ava lifted the receiver of the in-flight phone with precise, controlled movements, her fingers gripping the edge of the handset just a little too tightly. She didn't hesitate, didn't glance back at Marcus or Nia, didn't even acknowledge the quiet murmurs spreading like ripples through the cabin. She was doing what needed to be done. She had given them a chance to comply, to make this easy, but they had chosen to be difficult. Now she would handle this the way she handled all disruptions, swiftly, professionally, without room for debate. "This is Ava in first class," she said smoothly, her voice steady, unbothered. "I need security at Gate 14 immediately. 2 passengers are refusing to comply with flight crew instructions." Rachel's stomach twisted as she watched. This was happening. It was really happening. She had seen Ava escalate situations before, but this was different. The Bennetts weren't disruptive. They weren't aggressive. They weren't doing anything except refusing to be humiliated. And now, with that single phone call, Ava had shifted the power of the moment, turning a petty, unnecessary situation into something much bigger. A few rows back, the businessman in 3A let out a sharp breath, shaking his head in disbelief. "Oh, come on," he muttered, barely keeping his voice down. His seatmate, normally composed, looked genuinely alarmed now, her brows knitting together. "She's calling security over that?" she whispered, her fingers tightening around her tablet. The woman with the phone recording didn't stop. If anything, she repositioned her grip, subtly angling the camera to catch both Ava at the galley and the Bennetts in their seats. She had a feeling this footage was going to matter. Marcus didn't move. He sat perfectly still, one hand resting on his knee, the other lightly gripping the armrest. The only indication that he had registered what was happening was the slight clench of his jaw, the subtle shift of his fingers as they flexed against the fabric of his slacks. Nia, standing beside him, exhaled slowly, her expression unreadable. Rachel's hands curled into fists at her sides. She knew she should step in, say something, do something, but her training screamed at her to stay neutral, to let Ava handle it. That was the rule. You didn't question a senior flight attendant in front of passengers. You didn't undermine authority. You followed the chain of command. But she also knew what she was watching wasn't right. Ava set the phone back in its cradle with a sharp, decisive motion, then turned to face the cabin. She straightened her posture, regaining her composure, smoothing her uniform as she looked directly at Marcus and Nia. "Security will be here shortly," she said, her voice crisp, cool, professional. I suggest you both cooperate before this escalates further." The words landed like a warning, but they didn't have the effect she was expecting. Nia met Ava's gaze head-on, tilting her chin just slightly. "Oh, we'll wait," she said, her voice calm, even. "Let's see how this plays out." Ava blinked, momentarily thrown by the certainty in Nia's tone, the way she spoke as if she knew something Ava didn't. And then, just as Ava was about to turn away, Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. He tapped the screen once, then twice, then lifted it just slightly, just enough to indicate what he was doing without saying a word. He was recording now. Ava's breath hitched. Passengers murmured louder, the shift in the energy undeniable. This was no longer just a quiet dispute on a plane. This was something else entirely. Nia felt the low vibration of her phone in her purse and knew this was the moment. Without breaking eye contact with Ava, she slid her hand into her bag and retrieved her phone with the same practiced ease she used when handling tough negotiations in the courtroom. She didn't rush. She didn't fumble. She simply unlocked her screen, her fingers moving with quiet precision as she typed out a message. "Flight 227, first class, unacceptable treatment. Handle this immediately." She sent it to one person. Elaine Chambers, Senior Vice President of Customer Experience, an executive she had met years ago at a conference, a woman who had once told her, over cocktails at a corporate gala, "If you ever have an issue with our airline, call me directly. We take this kind of thing seriously." So Nia was calling in the favor. She hit send, locked the phone, and slid it back into her bag. Ava hadn't noticed. She was still standing there, arms crossed, glancing toward the front of the plane every few seconds, waiting for security to arrive, waiting for her authority to be reinforced. She was too busy keeping up appearances, too focused on the fact that Marcus had his phone up, recording everything. Rachel saw the text, or rather she saw Nia send something, the slight shift in posture, the flicker of intent in her eyes. Rachel wasn't stupid. She knew power when she saw it, and something told her Ava had no idea what she had just triggered. A lump formed in Rachel's throat. She took a step closer, then hesitated. Her heart was pounding now, not from fear, but from the internal war raging inside her. She had spent years working to get to this position, to build a reputation as a professional, reliable flight attendant. She wasn't supposed to question her colleagues, not publicly, not in front of passengers. But this was wrong. She could see it in the way other passengers were watching, their eyes darting between Ava and the Bennetts, their whispered conversations growing bolder. The businessman in 3A was openly scowling now, his fingers tapping impatiently against the armrest. The woman across the aisle had stopped pretending to read her tablet and was fully engaged, her brows furrowed in growing concern. The woman filming hadn't stopped recording, her phone steady in her grip. Rachel licked her lips, then took another step forward, just enough to close the distance between herself and Ava. "Ava," she said softly, low enough that only they could hear. Ava barely turned her head. "Not now." Rachel's stomach twisted. "They're not being disruptive," she pressed, keeping her voice calm, measured. "I really think we should—" "I said not now," Ava snapped under her breath, her voice sharp enough to make Rachel flinch. Marcus caught the exchange. His eyes flickered toward Rachel, reading the hesitation in her stance, the nervous way she held herself. He knew that look, too. Someone caught in a system, someone debating whether doing the right thing was worth the consequence. Rachel felt his gaze but couldn't meet it. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. Ava, oblivious to the fact that the power in the situation had already begun to shift, turned back toward the front of the plane. She had no idea what was coming. Rachel felt her pulse hammering in her ears. Her hands were clammy, her mind racing. She had spent years perfecting the art of staying in the background, of following protocol, of keeping her head down when things got messy. But this wasn't just a mistake or a misunderstanding. This was wrong, and every second that passed made it worse. She could see the tension tightening around the cabin, the subtle but growing outrage in the passengers' expressions, the shift in the air that told her this was no longer just between Ava and the Bennetts. Everyone was watching. She swallowed hard, then took a breath. Actually, her voice cut through the thick silence, not loud but firm enough to be heard by the closest rows. Ava turned sharply, eyes narrowing. Rachel's stomach twisted, but she forced herself to hold her ground. "I saw them show their tickets earlier," she continued, her voice steadying. "They belong here." The reaction was immediate. The businessman in 3A let out a quiet, satisfied scoff. "That's what I thought," he muttered, shaking his head. The woman recording the incident adjusted her grip on her phone, angling it slightly to make sure she captured everything. A few more murmurs rippled through the cabin. Hushed conversations exchanged in low tones. Ava's face froze, her carefully controlled expression faltering for just a second before she masked it with a tight-lipped smile. "Rachel," she said, her tone clipped, controlled, but carrying an unmistakable warning. "This is not your concern." Rachel felt her throat tighten, but there was no turning back now. "I think it is," she said, her voice gaining strength, "because I don't understand why they're being asked to leave their seats when their tickets were already verified, and if I don't understand, then maybe the passengers here don't either." Another ripple of agreement swept through the rows. The businessman exhaled sharply through his nose, leaning back in his seat with a knowing smirk, as if waiting to see how Ava would try to fix the hole she had just fallen into. The woman with the phone, recording everything, nodded slightly, as if encouraging Rachel to keep going. Ava's fingers twitched at her sides, her jaw tightening. "Rachel, I need you to step away from this," she hissed under her breath, her voice too low for the passengers to hear. "Now!" Rachel hesitated, doubt creeping in. Ava was senior to her. Ava had been in first class longer. Ava knew how to manipulate the rules in a way that made it nearly impossible to call her out without facing consequences. But then Rachel glanced at Marcus and Nia. Marcus, still seated, still composed, but watching her with that same unreadable expression, one that told her he knew exactly what she was struggling with. And Nia, standing tall, unwavering, waiting to see whether Rachel would keep going or fold. Rachel made her choice. She straightened her posture, lifted her chin slightly, and turned back toward Ava. "I think the captain should know what's happening here," she said. Ava's eyes darkened. Her control was slipping, and she knew it. Nia let the silence stretch between them, thick and heavy, pressing down on the cabin like an oncoming storm. She had given Ava every opportunity to correct herself, to stop this before it spiraled, but instead, Ava had doubled down. Now Nia was done playing along. She took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them with quiet precision, her heels clicking against the polished floor. The movement wasn't aggressive, but it carried weight, a silent declaration that she wasn't going to be pushed aside, wasn't going to be dismissed. She tilted her head slightly, eyes locked onto Ava's, her voice smooth but laced with steel. "This isn't about seats," she said, enunciating each word with measured control. "This is about the fact that you didn't expect people like us to be sitting here." A ripple moved through the cabin, a sharp collective inhale, a shift in energy so palpable it was almost audible. A few passengers exchanged looks, some murmuring under their breath while others just stared, waiting for what would happen next. Ava's face twitched, her forced composure cracking at the edges. "That's not," she started, but the words caught and she had to swallow before continuing. "That's not what this is about," she said, her voice thinner now, less certain. Nia arched an eyebrow. Ava's lips parted, but nothing came out. Nia let the silence drag a little longer before continuing. "Because I didn't see you pulling anyone else aside. I didn't see you checking anyone else's tickets twice, and I certainly didn't see you calling security for any other seating mix-ups." She let the words settle, then added, her voice dipping lower, "So tell me, what exactly made us different?" Ava opened her mouth, then shut it. Rachel exhaled softly, barely perceptible, but Nia caught it. The younger flight attendant looked uncomfortable now, shifting from foot to foot, her gaze flickering between Nia and Ava. She had already made her stance clear, but now, as Ava visibly struggled, it was becoming harder for Rachel to stay quiet. Ava's jaw clenched. "I was following protocol," she insisted, but even she seemed to hear how flimsy the excuse sounded. Protocol. Nia repeated, rolling the word over her tongue like she was testing it for flaws. So if we were anyone else, if we looked like anyone else, would you have followed that same protocol? Ava's throat bobbed as she swallowed. Her silence was an answer in itself. The businessman in 3A let out a sharp breath. "She's got a point," he muttered. The murmuring in the cabin grew louder. Ava's eyes darted toward the galley, toward the cockpit, anywhere but at Nia. For the first time, she looked nervous. Not frustrated, not inconvenienced. Nervous. Nia didn't move. Didn't break eye contact. Didn't let up. "You can call this whatever you want," she said, her voice soft but slicing through the tension like a blade. "But we both know what this really is." Ava had no response. The moment stretched, thick with unspoken truths. The tension in the cabin was no longer confined to Nia and Ava. It had spilled over, settling on the passengers who had, up until now, been silent spectators. But now, people were starting to react. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding eye contact, while others leaned in, their expressions hardening as realization sank in. A man in the second row, dressed in a golf polo and khakis, cleared his throat and adjusted his watch, his voice firm but neutral. "She's just doing her job," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "If there was a seating issue, then she has the right to check." A woman beside him, likely his wife, frowned but didn't disagree. "I mean, if it were me, I'd just go with her to clear it up," she added in a hushed voice, barely audible over the cabin noise. Across the aisle, however, the businessman in 3A scoffed audibly. "Come on," he muttered, rubbing a hand down his face. "This is beyond a seating issue. They've been sitting here this whole time, their tickets were checked twice, and now suddenly security's getting called?" He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "I don't buy it." Another voice piped up from the middle of first class, hesitant but firm. "This doesn't feel right," the woman with the navy blazer said, lowering her phone just slightly. "I've flown first class for years. I've never seen someone get asked to step away like this unless they were actually causing a problem." She glanced toward Ava, then back to the Bennetts. "And from what I can tell, they aren't." Rachel swallowed hard. She could feel it happening. The invisible line that had divided the cabin was becoming clearer, passengers falling on either side of the argument, deciding in real time whether they believed this was a real policy issue or something much worse. The man in 3A crossed his arms. "So what happens now?" he asked. "Security drags them off the plane? For what?" He turned toward Ava now, his voice edged with frustration. "Is that really what we're doing?" Ava's grip tightened at her sides, but she kept her face carefully neutral. "This is a matter of compliance," she said evenly. "Passengers are expected to follow crew instructions." Nia let out a quiet, humorless laugh, just enough for those closest to hear. "Compliance." She repeated the word as if it were something foreign, something absurd. "And what exactly are we complying with, Ava?" The businessman let out another scoff, shaking his head. "Unbelievable," he muttered. More murmurs spread, more passengers exchanging glances, more shifting in seats. Ava's confidence was slipping, and for the first time she seemed to realize it. This wasn't just about Marcus and Nia anymore. It was about everyone watching, about the perception shifting around her, about the fact that she had lost control of the narrative. He straightened, trying to reclaim authority. "I need everyone to remain seated," she said firmly, lifting her chin. "This is a security matter now." But the words didn't land the way she expected. Instead of quieting the room, they only added fuel to the growing fire. A sharp chime cut through the rising tension, the familiar tone of the intercom signaling an announcement from the cockpit. The cabin fell into an uneasy silence as a deep, steady voice filled the air. "Ava, report to the cockpit immediately." The command was calm but firm, with no room for interpretation. It wasn't a request. Ava stiffened. For the first time since this had begun, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. She hesitated, her grip tightening around the edge of her uniform as she glanced toward the front of the plane. The control she had been so sure of just moments ago was slipping through her fingers like sand, and she knew it. Passengers exchanged glances. The businessman in 3A smirked and shook his head. "Well, that's interesting," he murmured. The woman with the phone subtly angled her camera toward Ava, capturing every movement, every hesitation. Rachel held her breath. She had never seen Ava look shaken before. Ava inhaled sharply, steeling herself. She turned to Nia and Marcus one last time, as if debating whether to say something, to salvage what little authority she had left, but the look in Nia's eyes told her that moment had long passed. Without another word, Ava spun on her heel and strode toward the cockpit, her steps quick, her posture rigid. As she disappeared behind the curtain, the hum of whispers spread through first class. Marcus exhaled, adjusting the cuff of his blazer. "Now," he murmured to Nia, just loud enough for her to hear, "let's see how this really plays out." Ava stepped into the cockpit, her heart hammering in her chest as the door clicked shut behind her. The confined space felt even smaller under the weight of Captain Thomas Blake's unreadable gaze. He sat in his chair, his hands folded neatly on the console, his expression calm but firm, the look of a man who had already made a decision. The co-pilot barely spared her a glance, focused on his instruments, but the tension in the air told her he had heard everything. Ava straightened her posture, forcing herself to maintain her composure. "Captain," she began, keeping her tone professional, "I called security because 2 passengers refused to comply with—" "Sit down," Captain Blake interrupted, his voice smooth, steady, not angry, just final. Ava hesitated for a split second before lowering herself into the jump seat. She clasped her hands together in her lap, willing her fingers not to tremble. The captain exhaled through his nose and turned a tablet toward her. On the screen was a document, detailed, precise, and impossible to argue with. "I just got off a call with headquarters," he said. "They've been watching this situation closely, and do you know what they sent me, Ava?" She swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. "A record of past passenger complaints," he continued, tapping the screen. "Specifically, complaints about you." Ava's stomach twisted. "I don't have to explain myself," she said quickly, her voice sharper than she intended. "Those passengers were non-compliant. I was enforcing protocol." The captain's eyes locked onto hers, unwavering. "You assumed your authority would protect you," he said, his voice quieter now, but heavier somehow, like the weight of a gavel coming down. "But today, the system is watching you instead." Ava's breath caught in her throat. She glanced at the tablet again, scanning the text. Multiple complaints, patterns of behavior, incidents too similar to dismiss. A cold sweat prickled at the back of her neck. Captain Blake leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "This airline has worked too hard to recover from past controversies, and now, thanks to your actions, we have another one unfolding in real time. Passengers are recording this is already spreading, and headquarters doesn't want to deal with a lawsuit before we even take off." Ava shook her head, scrambling for a response. "Captain, you're done." The words sliced through the air with finality. Ava's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Captain Blake didn't wait for her to argue. He pressed the intercom button. "Senior Flight Attendant Dennis, report to the cockpit." Ava's stomach dropped. Dennis, not her. She knew what that meant. Her breathing came faster now, panic clawing up her throat. This wasn't just a reprimand, this was an order. She was about to be removed from the flight. Ava stepped out of the cockpit, her face pale, her steps slower than before. The confident, authoritative stride she had carried just minutes ago was gone, replaced by something stiffer, something hesitant. She wasn't used to feeling exposed, wasn't used to being on the receiving end of scrutiny, but now every step back toward first class felt like she was walking into a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided. Passengers had been waiting. The moment the cockpit door opened, all eyes snapped to her. The businessman in 3A sat back with his arms crossed, watching her with open amusement, his expression saying, "I knew it." The woman with the phone was still recording, her lens following Ava's every move. Rachel, standing near the galley, pressed her lips together, her hands gripping the edge of a drink cart as if bracing herself. She hadn't wanted things to go this far, but deep down she knew Ava had done this to herself. Ava's gaze flickered to Marcus and Nia. Nia was still standing, her arms folded, her expression unreadable. There was no smugness in her eyes, no overt satisfaction, just an unshaken, steady presence that made Ava's stomach churn. Marcus hadn't moved, still seated with one ankle crossed over his knee, watching her like he was studying a chessboard, already knowing the next 5 moves. The silence was suffocating. No one spoke, no one needed to. Ava swallowed hard and forced herself forward, keeping her head high, trying to salvage what little dignity she had left. But she could feel it, the weight of every glance, the quiet judgment hanging in the air. Even the passengers who had initially sided with her were avoiding her gaze now, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. She reached the galley where Dennis was already waiting, his expression unreadable. He didn't gloat, didn't scold. He simply gestured toward the intercom. "They'll be escorting you off as soon as we're back at the gate," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Ava inhaled sharply through her nose, her nails digging into her palms. She wasn't just losing control of this flight. She was losing everything. The wheels touched down with a smooth but final thud, the plane's momentum shifting forward as the engines roared softly, slowing their descent onto the runway. The usual rustling of passengers reaching for their belongings, the quiet beeps of seatbelts being unbuckled. None of that happened. The air inside first class was thick, charged, every person waiting, holding their collective breath, their attention fixed on the front of the plane, where they all knew what was coming. Ava sat rigid near the galley, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. Her chest rose and fell in sharp, shallow breaths, her mind racing through every possible way to salvage this, to explain herself, to control what happened next. But there was no protocol for this. No quick recovery, no walking away like nothing had happened. A sharp chime overhead signaled the captain's voice through the intercom, calm, professional, final. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Los Angeles. Please remain seated as we complete our taxi to the gate. First-class cabin crew stand by for security clearance." Ava's breath hitched. She felt them before she saw them. 2 uniformed security officers were already waiting outside the aircraft, visible through the small galley window, their posture firm, official, impassive. They weren't here for a discussion. They were here for her. A ripple of movement spread through the cabin as passengers subtly repositioned themselves. Phones lifted slightly, camera lenses angled, fingers hovered over record buttons. This wasn't just an uncomfortable moment anymore. This was a spectacle. The businessman in 3A shook his head, exhaling through his nose, his arms still crossed. "Damn," he muttered under his breath, not even trying to hide his satisfaction. The woman across the aisle, the one who had started recording earlier, didn't lower her phone. If anything, she adjusted her grip, her expression unreadable but her intent clear. This was going online before Ava even stepped off the plane. Rachel stood stiffly near the opposite galley, her hands resting on the service cart, her gaze darting between Ava and the approaching officers. She looked like she wanted to say something, but what was there to say? She had tried to stop this. Ava hadn't listened. Marcus and Nia hadn't moved. Marcus adjusted the sleeve of his blazer, his expression unreadable. Nia remained standing, her gaze unwavering, her presence unshaken. She wasn't gloating, she wasn't smiling, but there was something about the way she stood, composed, unbothered, that made it clear she had seen this coming from the very beginning. The plane came to a full stop. Ava's pulse pounded in her ears as one of the officers stepped inside, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. "Ms. Richardson, you need to come with us." She closed her eyes for half a second. Then, slowly, she stood. Ava could feel the weight of every single stare as she rose to her feet. The cabin, once filled with murmurs and whispers, had fallen eerily silent. The 2 security officers stood at the front waiting for her to move, their expressions neutral, unreadable. They weren't here to argue, they weren't here to negotiate, they were here to escort her off the plane, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Her breath came shallow, her throat tightening as she forced herself to walk toward the exit. She had always prided herself on control, on maintaining order, on keeping passengers in line without ever losing her composure. But now, she was the one being removed. She was the one who had lost control. And worst of all, she had to walk past them. Nia was still standing, her arms crossed, her presence unshaken. Marcus sat back in his seat, calm, composed, his gaze following Ava's every step with quiet calculation. Neither of them spoke as she approached. Neither of them smirked or gloated, but that was somehow worse. It would have been easier if they had been angry, if they had yelled, if they had made a scene. Instead, they simply watched her. They waited. Ava's stomach twisted. She hesitated for half a second as she reached their row, her hands tightening at her sides. The silence was unbearable. She had to say something, anything, to shift the weight of it, to take back even a fraction of the power she had lost. She swallowed hard, then, barely above a whisper, she muttered, "I apologize for the misunderstanding." Nia's head tilted slightly. Her lips parted just a fraction, as if she were considering whether Ava's words were even worth acknowledging. Then, in a voice smooth as glass but sharp as a knife, she replied, "A misunderstanding?" She let the words hang in the air, the weight of them stretching across the cabin, thick and suffocating. "No," she continued, her voice calm, controlled. "Deadly. A misunderstanding is when someone steps on your foot in a crowded aisle. A misunderstanding is when a flight gets delayed and no one can explain why. You," she exhaled slowly, shaking her head ever so slightly, "you tried to humiliate us." Ava's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the eyes on her now more than ever, the quiet judgment radiating from every corner of the cabin. The businessman in 3A let out a low chuckle, shaking his head as if to say, "She's right, and you know it." The woman still recording didn't even pretend to be discreet anymore, her camera locked onto Ava's face. For the first time in years, Ava had no response. Her face burned, her mouth dry, but she forced herself to keep moving. She turned sharply and walked toward the exit, her steps rigid, mechanical, humiliated. The moment she disappeared through the jet bridge, the silence in the cabin finally broke. A few passengers exhaled, shaking their heads. Someone muttered, "Unbelievable." Another voice whispered, "About time." Rachel closed her eyes briefly, releasing a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Nia took her seat again, crossing her legs with the same effortless grace she had carried throughout the entire flight. Marcus glanced at her, a small smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "Think she learned something?" he asked quietly. Nia reached for her water, taking a slow sip before answering. "She learned," she said, "but whether she understands..." She set the glass down, her gaze drifting toward the window, watching as the city lights flickered in the distance. "That's another story." The footage spread like wildfire. By the time Marcus and Nia had stepped off the plane and collected their bags, the video had already begun circulating online, a 30-second clip. Ava, standing stiffly near the galley, her voice sharp, her posture rigid as she insisted on removing them from their seats. Another angle caught Nia's cutting response, the unwavering way she had dismantled Ava's excuse with just a few words. Within hours, hashtags began trending. "First class while black." "Do better, airlines." "Nia was right." The video was reposted, dissected, analyzed. Twitter threads recounted similar stories, passengers of color sharing their own experiences of being challenged in spaces they had every right to be in. News outlets picked it up before the airline even had time to issue a statement. At headquarters, chaos erupted. Executives scrambled to contain the fallout. PR teams drafting statements, lawyers reviewing policy violations. By the next morning, an official response was issued. "We are aware of the disturbing incident that took place on Flight 227. The treatment of Mr. and Mrs. Bennett does not reflect our company's values. The employee involved has been placed on immediate leave pending investigation." But it was too late. The damage was already done. By noon, a leaked internal memo surfaced, confirming what many had already suspected. Ava Richardson had multiple complaints filed against her for similar behavior. The airline had ignored them. Until now. Another statement was released just hours later. Effective immediately, Ava Richardson is no longer employed with our airline. Rachel saw the news while sitting in the crew lounge, her stomach twisting. She had known it would come to this, had felt it unraveling in real time, but seeing the words in black and white made it real. Ava was fired. Passengers celebrated online, calling it justice. Others debated whether she deserved to have her entire career ruined over one incident. But for Nia and Marcus, the conversation was never just about Ava. It was about why she had felt so comfortable doing what she did in the first place. And more importantly, what would change now? Rachel sat in the break room, staring at her phone, scrolling through news articles, social media threads, and airline statements. The video of Ava's meltdown had gone viral overnight, but the fallout was even bigger than she'd imagined. Not only had Ava been fired, but the airline was now under intense scrutiny, with passengers sharing their own experiences of discrimination and bias while flying. Rachel exhaled, rubbing her hands together as she reread the company's latest statement. "We are committed to fostering an inclusive environment for all passengers. Moving forward, we will be implementing new training protocols and reviewing past complaints with the seriousness they deserve." She wasn't naive. She knew companies only made promises like this when they were backed into a corner. Still, the fact that they were being forced to address it at all meant something. "Rachel?" She looked up to see Dennis standing in the doorway. He gave her a small nod, his expression unreadable. "Captain Blake wants to see you." Her stomach tightened. She wasn't sure why, but the way he said it made her nervous. Was she in trouble for speaking up? She followed Dennis down the hallway, her mind racing. Inside the office, Captain Blake sat behind a desk, flipping through a file. When she entered, he gestured for her to sit. "Rachel," he said, setting the papers aside, "I've been reviewing the reports from Flight 227, as well as speaking with some of the passengers who reached out after the incident." Rachel swallowed, forcing herself to keep her posture straight. "Sir, if this is about me overstepping with Ava, you did the right thing." The words stopped her cold. She blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. Captain Blake leaned forward, his hands clasped. "We need more crew members like you, Rachel. People who understand that following procedure doesn't mean blindly excusing bad behavior. People who are willing to speak up when something isn't right." He exhaled, nodding slightly. "I just got off the phone with corporate. They're offering you a promotion. Lead flight attendant." Rachel's breath caught. "A promotion? I don't know what to say," she stammered. Blake gave her a knowing look. "Say yes, because you earned it." Rachel exhaled, nodding as a slow, relieved smile crossed her face. Maybe, just maybe, integrity really did matter. The airport was bustling as Marcus and Nia made their way through the terminal, the hum of conversations and rolling suitcases filling the space around them. It had been months since Flight 227, months since that moment when the air had felt thick with judgment, when a simple flight had turned into something much bigger than either of them had anticipated. But today felt different. They moved with the same quiet confidence as always, Marcus in a crisp charcoal suit, Nia in a sleek navy dress, their presence commanding without effort. As they approached the first-class boarding lane, a flight attendant at the gate smiled warmly. "Welcome aboard, Mr. and Mrs. Bennett," she said without hesitation, scanning their tickets and handing them back with ease. No second glances, no pauses, no unnecessary verification. As they stepped onto the plane and into the first-class cabin, the shift was subtle but undeniable. The flight attendants greeted them without hesitation, directing them to their seats as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Because it was. Nia settled into her seat, adjusting her handbag as Marcus placed his carry-on in the overhead bin. When he sat beside her, he exhaled, a knowing look passing between them. "Feels different this time," Marcus murmured. Nia smirked, crossing one leg over the other. "It should," she said. "Some lessons take longer to sink in than others." A few rows ahead, a flight attendant moved efficiently through the cabin, double-checking seat assignments and offering pre-flight beverages. When she reached their row, she paused, then smiled. "Mrs. Bennett," she said warmly, "it's good to see you again." Nia glanced up, surprised, before recognition set in. It was Rachel. Her uniform was the same, but there was something different about her now. A quiet authority, a steadiness in the way she carried herself. "Lead flight attendant." Nia's smile deepened. "It's good to see you too, Rachel," she said. Rachel nodded, her gaze unwavering. "Let me know if you need anything," she said before moving on, greeting the next passengers with the same ease. Marcus watched Rachel for a moment before turning to Nia, his voice low. "Looks like she got exactly where she was meant to be." Nia glanced toward the front of the plane, where Rachel moved with quiet confidence, her presence a testament to the fact that standing up for what was right sometimes came with rewards. "Yes," Neil murmured, picking up her glass of water. "I suppose she did." The flight doors closed, the engines hummed to life. This time there was no tension, no questioning, no battle to be fought. Just a flight. Exactly the way it should have been all along. As the plane ascended, Marcus gazed out the window, watching the city shrink below them. The sky stretched endlessly ahead, clear and open, a stark contrast to the storm they had faced months ago. He exhaled, shaking his head slightly as if still processing everything that had led them to this moment. Nia, beside him, scrolled through her phone absent-mindedly before locking the screen and setting it down. She turned to Marcus, studying his expression. "You're thinking about it again?" she murmured. Marcus smirked but didn't deny it. Hard not to. He leaned back in his seat, fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. "We had the resources, the connections, the ability to fight back, but how many people go through this every day and don't?" Nia's expression shifted, her gaze distant. She had spent years in courtrooms, representing people who had been wronged but lacked the means to challenge the systems working against them. That day on Flight 227, she and Marcus had been able to push back, to hold their ground, to ensure there were consequences. But what about the ones who couldn't? The ones who were forced to quietly step aside, to accept humiliation, to swallow injustice because they didn't have the luxury of doing anything else? Her fingers curled slightly against the fabric of her dress. "That's the real question, isn't it?" she said softly. "How many times has this happened without cameras rolling, without anyone speaking up?" Marcus nodded, his jaw tightening. "And what happens when there's no viral video? No executive contact to call? No one willing to intervene?" He turned his head slightly, his gaze locking onto hers. "What would you do in that situation?" Nia held his stare for a long moment, then sighed, shaking her head. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I do know one thing." Marcus lifted a brow, waiting. "I know that every time we let something like this go unchallenged, we make it easier for it to happen again," she said. "And every time we fight back, we make it just a little harder for the next person to be treated like they don't belong." A beat of silence passed between them. Then Marcus smiled. Small, but real. "That's why I married you," he murmured. Nia smirked. "I thought it was my good looks." "That too," Marcus admitted. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the hum of the plane filling the space between them. In the distance, Rachel moved through the cabin, pausing briefly to ensure everyone was settled. She caught Nia's gaze and nodded. Just a small gesture, a silent acknowledgement of what had passed between them and how it had changed them both. Nia returned the nod, then leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes. This wasn't the end, but it was a start. What happened on Flight 227 wasn't just about 2 passengers or 1 flight attendant. It was about something much bigger, the quiet, everyday battles that too many people face in spaces where they should belong without question. Marcus and Nia had the resources, the connections, and the ability to fight back. But what about the ones who don't? How many people are asked to prove they deserve a seat they already paid for? How many are forced to stay silent because speaking up could cost them more than just their dignity? Change doesn't happen in a single moment, but in the choices we make every day, in the moments we choose to challenge injustice instead of looking the other way, in the voices that refuse to be silenced. Now it's your turn. Have you ever witnessed or experienced discrimination? What did you do? What would you do if you were in this situation? Share your story in the comments below. And if you believe stories like this need to be heard, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories of courage, resistance, and change. Together, we can make sure no one has to fight these battles alone.